A homeless girl just walked into a billionaire's wedding barefoot, holding a flash drive, and said 5 words that made every guest pull out their phones. "This is why my father died." What she revealed next destroyed more than just the ceremony. It exposed a billion-dollar secret that powerful men had killed to protect. The chandeliers caught fire first. Not real fire, just light. Thousands of crystal drops reflecting 200 faces turned toward the altar, phones raised, breaths held. The kind of silence that only money could buy. Darius Blackwell stood in a Tom Ford tuxedo that cost more than most people earned in 6 months, his hands folded too tightly in front of him, knuckles pale against his dark skin. The officiant's voice floated somewhere above him. Words about forever. About commitment. About 2 souls becoming one. Darius wasn't listening. His fiancée, Elena Whitcomb, stood 3 feet away in a gown that had taken 8 fittings and a team of seamstresses flown in from Milan. Her smile was camera-ready. Her father, Senator Whitcomb, sat in the front row with that expression powerful men wear when they are watching an investment mature. But Darius couldn't stop staring at the back of the room. The murmur started near the entrance. A ripple of confusion that spread like spilled wine across white linen. Security moved first. 2 men in black suits stepped forward, hands reaching for their earpieces. Darius raised his palm without thinking. The gesture stopped them cold. Because walking down the center aisle, barefoot on imported marble, was a girl who had no business being there. She wore the same faded jacket she'd been wearing for months. Her hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail. She carried a plastic shopping bag in one hand. Every eye turned. Elena's smile fractured at the edges. The girl stopped 10 feet from the altar. Darius's throat closed. He knew her face the way you know a scar. The way you know the sound of your own heartbeat when fear kicks in. Not because they'd ever had a conversation. Not because he'd ever asked her name. But because for 362 mornings, he'd put $5 into her hand and walked away before she could say thank you. The street girl, someone whispered behind a cupped hand. Now if you're watching from New York, Lagos, London, or anywhere in between, you already know that weddings like this don't get interrupted unless the truth is bigger than the ceremony. Drop your city in the comments right now because what happens next is going to show you why some secrets are worth more than billions. And if you're new to stories that reveal what powerful people try to hide, go ahead and subscribe so you don't miss what she's about to expose. The girl's eyes locked onto Darius. Not Elena. Not the senator. Not the cameras already recording. Just him. She took 1 step closer. Security tensed again, but Darius's hand stayed raised. His chest rose and fell too fast. Sweat gathered at his collar despite the air conditioning that kept the room at exactly 70 degrees. The girl reached into her plastic bag. Elena grabbed Darius's arm. Her nails pressed into his sleeve. But the girl didn't pull out a weapon. She pulled out a flash drive. Small. Black. Unremarkable except for the way Darius's entire body went rigid when he saw it. She held it up between 2 fingers. "You gave me $5 every day," she said. Her voice carried across the silent room like a stone dropped into still water. "You never asked why I needed it." Darius opened his mouth. Nothing came out. The girl took another step. "You never asked my name either." The officiant cleared his throat nervously. A camera flash went off. Someone's phone buzzed. "It's Zainab," she said. "Zainab Afolayan." The name hit Darius like a fist. His knees almost buckled. Because somewhere in the back of his mind, buried under a decade of deals and signatures and documents he'd stopped reading carefully, that name lived. It lived in a file he'd never opened. In a report someone had flagged as urgent that he'd marked as handled. Zainab took 1 more step forward. "And this," she held up the flash drive higher, "is why my father died." The room exploded into noise. Gasps. Chairs scraping back. Phones rising higher. But Darius couldn't hear any of it. All he could hear was his own pulse hammering in his ears as his brain raced backward. Not to this morning, not to yesterday, but to a cold Tuesday morning exactly 1 year ago when he'd first seen a girl standing in the rain with a cup of boiled eggs and eyes that looked like they'd already seen the end of the world. Why does a billionaire recognize a homeless girl by instinct alone? The alarm always went off at 5:45. Darius never hit snooze. He was out of bed before the second beep, feet hitting Italian marble, brain already running through the day's calendar. Conference call with Dubai at 7. Quarterly reports by 9. Lunch meeting he didn't want but couldn't cancel. By 6:05, he was dressed. By 6:08, he was out the door of his penthouse. His driver waited downstairs. The Maybach idled at the curb, exhaust curling in the early morning cold. But Darius always waved him off. 10 minutes, he'd say. Same words. Same route. Same reason he never explained. He walked 2 blocks north. Past the coffee shop that wasn't open yet. Past the newsstand where the same old man sorted papers in the dark. Past the luxury gym with floor-to-ceiling windows where people ran on treadmills that cost more than a used car. At 6:10 exactly, he reached the subway entrance on 125th. She was always there, standing just outside the railing, never blocking the stairs, never calling out, just standing with her plastic cup of boiled eggs balanced on the edge of a cardboard box, her breath visible in the cold. Darius never looked at her face. He pulled the $5 bill from his pocket, always a 5, never more, never less, and placed it in her hand. Her fingers were cold every single time. He'd noticed that for half a second before pulling away. She never said thank you. He never said you're welcome. The entire exchange took 4 seconds. Maybe 5. Then he kept walking. His driver would pick him up 1 block over, and Darius would climb into the back seat and check his phone like nothing had happened. Like he hadn't just performed the same ritual he'd been performing every morning for almost a year. $5. To a man worth $3.2 billion, it was nothing. Loose change. A rounding error on the interest his money made while he slept. But he never missed a day. Not when it rained. Not when it snowed. Not when he flew back from Singapore at 4 in the morning and had exactly 90 minutes of sleep before the alarm went off again. He told himself it was routine. Discipline. The same reason he went to the gym 5 days a week and answered emails within 2 hours. But somewhere deeper, in a place he refused to look, he knew it was something else. It was the only transaction in his entire life where he lost money on purpose. At first, he hadn't even noticed her. Just another body in a city full of bodies trying to survive. But after the 3rd morning, he'd started recognizing the jacket. The way she stood with her shoulders back even when the wind tried to push her forward. The way she never begged. That last part mattered to him more than he wanted to admit. She didn't perform poverty. Didn't hold up signs or tell stories. She just stood there with her eggs and her dignity, and somehow that made it easier for him to keep walking after he gave her the money. No guilt required. No conversation needed. $5 bought him silence. But 3 months in, something shifted. He started noticing she was never late. Never early. Always there at exactly 6:10, as if she'd synchronized her life to his. He told himself it was coincidence. Then he started noticing she watched him approach. Not the money in his hand. Him. Her eyes tracked his face, his gait, the way he held his shoulders. Like she was studying him. That thought bothered him more than it should have. So he started walking faster. Extending his arm earlier so the transaction happened from farther away. But she was always there. Rain or shine. Summer heat or winter freeze. Always there. One morning in July, he'd almost asked her name. The question had risen in his throat as his hand touched hers, and for one strange second, he'd felt like he was standing on the edge of something he couldn't see the bottom of. He'd swallowed the question. Kept walking. Because names made things real. Names turned transactions into relationships. And relationships required something Darius had spent his entire adult life avoiding. Responsibility beyond a signature. On a Thursday in September, he'd noticed she wasn't selling any eggs. The cup sat empty. Her face looked thinner. But she still stood there, back straight, eyes forward. He'd put the $5 in her hand. She'd closed her fingers around it slowly, and for the first time, she'd looked directly at him. Not at his hand. Not at the money. At him. He'd felt his pulse jump. Then she'd looked away, and he'd walked faster than usual to where his driver waited. That night, lying awake in his $15 million penthouse, he'd wondered why a girl who clearly needed more than $5 never asked for it. The thought had kept him up until 3 in the morning. But the next day at 6:10, he'd given her $5 again. And the next day. And the day after that. Until the ritual became a fact. A fixed point in his carefully controlled universe. Until one morning in late November when he'd handed her the money and noticed something that made his stomach drop. She wasn't watching the money anymore. She was watching him the way someone watches a name they're trying to remember. And when he met her eyes for half a second before looking away, he saw something that chilled him worse than the winter air. She looked confirmed. Zainab woke at 4:30 every morning when the delivery trucks started rattling down the avenue. She slept behind Kim's beauty supply on a flattened stretch of cardboard she folded each dawn and hid behind the dumpster. Her blanket was a promotional tarp from a cell phone store that had closed 3 years ago. She kept her backpack pressed against her chest while she slept, both arms wrapped around it. Everything she owned fit inside that bag. 2 pairs of underwear, 1 extra shirt, a toothbrush she'd stolen from a drugstore, a cracked phone with no service that she used only to check the time on public Wi-Fi, and buried in the lining, sewn into the fabric with dental floss, something nobody could ever see. By 5:15, she was awake and moving. She washed her face with water from a church fountain 2 blocks away, changed her shirt behind a row of bushes, combed her hair with her fingers. By 5:45, she'd walked to the corner store that opened early for construction workers. She bought 6 eggs with the last of yesterday's coins, boiled them on the hot plate the owner let her use because his daughter had once been homeless too. By 6, she was positioned at her spot near the subway entrance. And by 6:10, she was watching Darius Blackwell walk toward her with a $5 bill already in his hand. She'd known who he was by the 3rd week. Not from his face. She didn't watch television or read newspapers. But from the watch. A platinum Patek Philippe that caught the morning light in a way that made her chest hurt. Her father had worn the same watch. Not the same model. The same brand. A gift from his employer before everything went wrong. So one morning, after Darius walked away, Zainab had used the library computer to search. She'd typed in every detail she could remember. Tall. Black. Early 40s. Platinum watch. Walks alone at 6 in the morning. Manhattan. The image results had loaded slowly on the library's ancient Wi-Fi. Then his face filled the screen. Darius Blackwell. Founder and CEO of Blackwell Capital Management. Net worth $3.2 billion. Known for hostile takeovers and offshore investments. Reputation for ruthlessness softened by occasional philanthropy. She'd scrolled down. Past the Forbes profile. Past the business acquisitions. Past the charity galas. Until she found it. A press release from 6 years ago. Blackwell Capital announces partnership with Keyhind Moreo Energy Solutions for West African infrastructure development. Zainab's hands had started shaking so badly she'd had to close the browser. Because she knew that name the way you know the name of the person who killed your family. That night, she'd gone back to her cardboard square behind the beauty supply store and cried until her throat bled. But the next morning at 6:10, she was standing at her spot when Darius walked up. She took his $5. She watched him walk away. And she'd started planning. At first, rage had been enough. The kind of rage that keeps you warm when you have no heat. The kind that makes you remember you're still alive. She'd wanted to scream at him, to shove the money back in his face, to tell him exactly who she was and what his signature had done. But rage doesn't survive long on the streets. It burns too many calories you can't afford to waste. So Zainab had taught herself patience instead. She watched him, studied his patterns, noticed the way he never looked at her face, the way his hand shook slightly when the weather was cold, the way he walked faster on Thursdays, like he was running from something behind him. She noticed he never gave her more than $5. Not 6, not 10, not 20, always 5. Like generosity had a limit he'd calculated down to the exact bill. That detail told her more about Darius Blackwell than any Forbes profile ever could. It told her he was a man who controlled everything, who measured kindness the same way he measured risk, who needed to believe that $5 made him different from the men he did business with. 3 months in, she'd started testing him. One morning, she'd positioned herself 5 feet farther from the subway entrance. He'd adjusted his route without thinking, walking the extra steps to reach her. Another morning, she'd been 30 seconds late. He'd waited, checking his watch, looking uncomfortable. But he'd waited. She'd realized then that the ritual wasn't about her. It was about him. He needed to give her that $5 the same way some people need coffee. It wasn't kindness. It was maintenance. Something that let him sleep at night in his penthouse while she froze 2 miles away on cardboard. That knowledge had changed something in her. The rage had cooled into something sharper, Cleaner. Strategy. She'd gone back to the library. Used the computers to learn everything about him. His company. His investments. His upcoming marriage to Senator Whitcomb's daughter. She'd read about the wedding. The venue. The guest list. The press coverage. And she'd understood exactly what it meant. It meant Darius Blackwell was about to lock himself into a future where the past couldn't touch him. Where men like Kehind Moreo would become untouchable too. Where girls like her would stay invisible forever. That was when she'd checked the lining of her backpack one more time, running her fingers over the shape of the flash drive sewn into the fabric. The last thing her father had given her before he disappeared. She'd never opened the files. Didn't have a computer of her own. Didn't know exactly what evidence was buried in those encrypted folders. But she knew it was enough. Enough to ruin men. Enough to end empires. Enough to make a billionaire's hand shake when he saw it. For months ago, she'd started preparing. Memorizing names. Dates. Details from the news articles she could access. Building the story in her head until she could tell it without crying. And every morning at 6:10, she'd taken Darius's $5 and watched him walk away, knowing he had no idea who she was. Knowing he thought $5 was the price of his conscience. 2 weeks ago, she'd seen his name on a billboard in Times Square. A Rolex advertisement. His face 40 feet high, smiling that controlled smile, wearing a watch that cost more than most people's houses. She'd stood there staring up at him for 20 minutes. Cars honked. People bumped past her. The noise of the city swallowed everything. But Zainab hadn't moved. Because she wasn't surprised to see him there. She was confirmed. The memory came at 3 in the morning when Darius couldn't sleep. He was 12 again. Standing in his father's study in their old house in Detroit. The carpet was worn near the desk where his father sat most nights, going through papers with reading glasses perched on his nose. His father had been an accountant for automotive suppliers. Small contracts. Decent money. Enough to keep the lights on and send Darius to a good school. That night, his father had looked up from a stack of invoices and called him over. "Come here, son. Let me show you something." Darius had walked around the desk. His father pointed to a column of numbers highlighted in yellow. "See this? These payments don't match the delivery records." 12-year-old Darius hadn't understood what that meant. His father had explained it slowly. Someone was stealing. Moving money through fake invoices. Small amounts at first. Then bigger. The kind of theft that looked like mistakes until you added it all up. "What are you going to do?" Darius had asked. His father had taken off his glasses. Rubbed his eyes. Put the glasses back on. Nothing. The word had confused Darius more than the numbers. "But they are stealing." "I know. So tell someone." His father had turned in his chair to look at him directly. The expression on his face was something Darius had never seen before and would spend the rest of his life trying to forget. Defeat wearing a mask of practicality. "If I report this, I'll lose my job. We'll lose the house. Your mother's medical bills don't pay themselves." His father had turned back to the papers. "Sometimes the cost of doing the right thing is more than we can afford." Darius had gone back to his room that night feeling something shift in his chest. Like a bone setting wrong after a break. His father had kept that job for 6 more years. Never said another word about the numbers. Retired with a handshake and a watch that stopped working 3 months later. He died when Darius was 25. Heart attack at 61. Sudden. Clean. Gone. At the funeral, Darius had stood by the casket and made himself a promise. He'd never be the kind of man who looked away. Never be the kind who traded truth for comfort. He'd built his entire empire on that promise. Hostile takeovers. Aggressive audits. Zero tolerance for creative accounting. His reputation was built on being the man who didn't blink. But now, lying in his penthouse at 3 in the morning, Darius stared at the ceiling and felt that old bone ache. Because somewhere in the back of his mind, buried under a decade of deal flow and due diligence, there was a file he'd never opened. A report marked urgent that his legal team had summarized for him. West African infrastructure deal. Partnership with Moreo Energy Solutions. Projected returns in the high double digits. His lawyer had mentioned some complications. Local disputes. Documentation issues. Nothing unusual for emerging markets. Darius had signed anyway. Because the returns were too good. Because everyone else was doing it. because looking too closely might mean walking away from 9 figures in profit. He'd given himself the same excuse his father had given him 20 years earlier. Sometimes you can't afford to do the right thing. And to make himself feel better about it, he'd started giving $5 to a homeless girl every morning. $5. The exact price he'd calculated his conscience was worth. Darius rolled over and checked his phone. 3:17. His alarm would go off in 2.5 hours. He closed his eyes and tried to sleep. But all he could see was his father's face the night he'd explained why some things were better left alone. At 6:10 the next morning, Darius walked his usual route. The girl was there. Same spot. Same jacket. Same plastic cup of eggs. He reached into his pocket for the $5 bill. But this time, when he held it out, his hand wouldn't stop shaking. She noticed. Their eyes met for longer than 4 seconds. Longer than 5. Long enough that Darius felt his throat close up with a question he'd been swallowing for months. He opened his mouth, then closed it, pulled his hand back before she could take the money, walked away without giving her anything. That same night, Zainab sat behind the beauty supply store and unzipped her backpack. She pulled out the phone with no service and used the McDonald's Wi-Fi to check something she'd been checking every day for 6 months. The wedding announcement was still pinned at the top of Darius Blackwell's Instagram. 3 weeks away. She put the phone back, reached into the lining of her backpack and felt the shape of the flash drive. Then she whispered a name she'd been carrying like a stone for 2 years. Kihind Moreo. The flash drive was the size of Zainab's thumb and weighed almost nothing. She'd carried it for so long she sometimes forgot it was there. Sewn into the lining of her backpack with dental floss she'd stolen from a corner store. Hidden in a pocket she'd cut into the fabric herself using a safety pin and patience. Most nights, she didn't think about it. But some nights, when the cold was bad enough that sleep wouldn't come, she'd press her hand against the outside of the bag and feel the small hard shape through the layers. Proof that she hadn't imagined everything. Her father had given it to her the last time she saw him. Not handed it to her directly. He'd been too careful for that. Too scared. He'd hidden it in her school bag the morning before he left for work, tucked into the pages of her chemistry textbook with a note written on the back of a receipt. Keep this safe. Tell no one. If something happens to me, get to your aunt in Abuja. She'll know what to do. Zainab had found it during 3rd period. Read the note twice. Put both in her bag and spent the rest of the day pretending her hands weren't shaking. Her father had come home that night. Made dinner. Asked about her homework. Watched television like everything was normal. But he'd hugged her before bed. Held on longer than usual. Kissed her forehead twice. I love you, baby girl. Always remember that. She'd rolled her eyes. Told him he was being dramatic. That was the last conversation they ever had. 3 days later, the police came to their house at 2 in the morning. Her father's body had been found in a drainage ditch near the port. Robbery, they said. Wrong place, wrong time. They'd ruled it accidental within a week. Zainab's mother had known better. She'd stopped eating. Stopped leaving the house. Stopped pretending the world was safe. 6 months later, she was dead too. The doctors called it pneumonia. Zainab knew it was a broken heart that had finally stopped trying. Her aunt in Abuja had taken her in, fed her, kept her alive. But 3 months after that, men had shown up asking questions about her father. About documents. About things Zainab didn't understand. Her aunt had packed a bag that same night. You need to leave Nigeria. Tonight. Away. Anywhere. I have a cousin in New York who can help you get started. The cousin turned out to be a lie. Or maybe the cousin had been real but changed their mind. Either way, when Zainab landed at JFK with borrowed documents and $100 in cash, no one was waiting. She'd been 17. Now she was 19. And the flash drive that had traveled from Lagos to Abuja to New York was still sewn into her backpack, waiting. She'd tried to open it once. At the public library 6 months ago. But the files were encrypted. Password protected. She'd clicked through folder after folder of locked documents she couldn't read. Her father had been careful. Too careful. But even without opening the files, Zainab knew what was inside. She'd heard enough whispered conversations. Seen enough fear in her mother's eyes. Offshore accounts. Shell companies. Money moving through fake contracts. Payments to officials who looked the other way while oil disappeared from Nigerian ports and reappeared in European markets. Her father had worked logistics. He'd seen the numbers that didn't match, tracked the shipments that didn't exist, built a paper trail that connected American investment firms to the men who killed anyone who asked too many questions. And one of those firms was Blackwell Capital Management. Zainab had spent months researching, using library computers, reading old news articles, following the thread from Lagos to London to New York. Darius Blackwell's partnership with Keyhind Moreo wasn't hidden. It was public record. Press releases celebrating infrastructure development. Photos of them shaking hands at a conference in Dubai. But what wasn't public was what Moreo did with that money once it reached Nigeria. The bribes, the threats, the bodies that washed up in rivers when someone tried to audit the contracts. Bodies like her father's. Zainab had no proof that Darius knew about any of it. Maybe he didn't. Maybe he'd signed papers his lawyers prepared and never asked questions. But that didn't make him innocent. It just made him the kind of man who could give a homeless girl $5 every morning and sleep fine at night. The kind who calculated exactly how much guilt cost and paid it in cash. Last week, she'd finally found what she needed. A computer programmer at the library had shown her how to bypass the encryption. He'd thought he was helping a college student recover a lost thesis. She'd opened the first file at 2 in the afternoon on a Tuesday. By 4, her hands were shaking so badly she had to close the laptop. Bank statements, email chains, signed contracts, photos of cash transfers, names, dates, amounts. Everything her father had collected before he died. Everything that proved Keyhind Moreo wasn't just corrupt, he was protected. Protected by men like Darius Blackwell who moved money and asked no questions. Protected by systems that made it easier to look away than look close. She'd copied the files onto a second drive, backed them up on a cloud server using a fake email. Then she'd sewn the original back into her bag and started planning. The wedding was in 3 weeks. 3 weeks until Darius Blackwell locked himself into a family with enough political power to bury the past forever. 3 weeks until Keyhind Moreo became untouchable. 3 weeks until the last chance to make anyone care that her father had died for telling the truth. Zainab stood up from her cardboard square and walked to the corner where streetlight met shadow. She pulled out the phone with no service and checked the date on the McDonald's Wi-Fi. Then she whispered the name again. Louder this time. Keyhind Moreo. A delivery truck rumbled past. Early morning light started creeping across the sky. And 10 blocks away, Darius Blackwell's alarm went off at 5:45. The email came on a Wednesday morning while Darius was in a meeting with his acquisitions team. His phone buzzed twice on the conference table. He ignored it. The third buzz made his assistant glance over with concern. Darius picked up the phone. The sender was listed as K. Moreo Energy Solutions. Subject line, Partnership Renewal Discussion. His stomach dropped before he even opened it. The message was short. Professional. The kind of corporate language that said everything and nothing. Darius, hoping we can connect before your upcoming celebration. Several matters require discussion regarding our ongoing collaboration. Best handled in person. Looking forward to continued success together. Darius set the phone down carefully. His acquisitions director was still talking about the Brazilian mining deal. Charts on the screen. Projected returns. Risk assessment. But Darius wasn't listening anymore. Because Keyhind Moreo didn't send casual emails. And he definitely didn't use phrases like matters require discussion unless something had gone wrong. The meeting ended at 11. Darius went back to his office and closed the door. He pulled up the original contract from 6 years ago. Read through the partnership terms, the profit-sharing structure, the infrastructure commitments. All of it looked clean on paper. But paper was designed to look clean. That was the whole point. His phone rang. Elena. He almost didn't answer. Then reminded himself that ignoring her 2 weeks before the wedding was a problem he couldn't afford. Hey. Hey yourself. You sound stressed. Just work. Always work. Her voice had that edge it got when she was about to start a fight. My mother wants to know if you finalized the seating chart. I'll handle it. That's what you said last week. Darius pinched the bridge of his nose. Elena. I said I'll handle it. Silence on the other end. Then a sigh. You know my father's bringing half of Congress to this thing. right? We can't afford mistakes. I know. Do you? Because sometimes I feel like you're not even present for your own wedding. He wanted to tell her that he'd been having the same feeling, that every time he thought about walking down that aisle, something in his chest tightened like a fist closing around his ribs. Instead, he said what he always said. I'm sorry. You're right. I'll take care of it today. Another sigh. Softer this time. Okay. I love you. Love you too. He hung up before she could say anything else. That afternoon, his head of security stopped by his office. Marcus Jennings, former Secret Service. The kind of professional who never wasted words. We need to talk about the wedding. Darius looked up from his laptop. What about it? Your morning routine. Darius went still. Marcus pulled out his phone and showed him a photo. Grainy surveillance footage from a traffic camera. Darius handing money to Zainab near the subway entrance. You've been doing this every morning for almost a year. So it's a security risk. You're alone. Predictable. Creating a pattern. She's not dangerous. You don't know that. Darius closed his laptop. Is there a point to this conversation? Marcus put his phone away. The point is that in 2 weeks, you're marrying into a family with serious political connections. Secret Service will be at that wedding. FBI probably. If any of them run background on the people in your routine and find something concerning, it becomes our problem. She's homeless, Marcus. Not a terrorist. Homeless people have histories, connections, motivations we don't see. Marcus crossed his arms. I'm recommending you stop the morning walks until after the wedding. Or at minimum, let me assign someone to walk with you. Darius stared at him for a long moment. Then he said the thing he'd been thinking for months but never admitted out loud. You ever feel like you're being watched by someone who knows more about you than you know about them? Marcus frowned. What? Nothing. Forget it. Darius waved him off. I'll think about what you said. After Marcus left, Darius sat alone in his office until the sun dropped behind the buildings across the street. He thought about the email from Moreo, the wedding in 2 weeks, the girl who was always there at 6:10. He thought about his father sitting in that study in Detroit, explaining why some things were easier to ignore. His phone buzzed again. Another email. This time from his lawyer. Darius, flagging this for your attention. Nigerian authorities have reopened an investigation into offshore accounts tied to Moreo Energy. No direct exposure for Blackwell Capital yet, but recommend we schedule a call to review our documentation. Darius deleted the email without responding. He left the office at 7, skipped dinner, went home to his empty penthouse and stood by the window looking out at Manhattan glowing like a circuit board in the dark. His phone buzzed one more time. A text from Elena's father. Senator Whitcomb. Looking forward to officially welcoming you to the family, son. Big things ahead for both of us. Darius put the phone face down on the counter. Then he poured himself 3 fingers of whiskey and tried not to think about the fact that in 2 weeks, he'd be locked into a future where walking away from anything would cost more than he could afford to pay. The next morning at 6:10, Darius walked his usual route. But when he reached the subway entrance, someone else was standing there. Not Zainab. A man. Tall. Dark jacket. Hands in his pockets. He looked directly at Darius. Didn't smile. Didn't speak. Just stood there watching. Darius's pulse jumped. He looked past the man. No sign of Zainab. No plastic cup. No eggs. Just empty sidewalk and early morning shadows. The man tilted his head slightly. Like he was checking something. Confirming something. Then he turned and walked away. Darius stood frozen for 5 seconds. 10. Then he pulled out his phone and called Marcus. I need you to find someone. That night, Zainab didn't return to her sleeping spot behind the beauty supply store. The blood came from her nose first. Zainab tasted copper before she felt the pain. Her head snapped back against brick, and for 3 seconds the world went white and silent. Then sound rushed back. Footsteps. Heavy breathing that wasn't hers. A voice speaking a language she recognized but couldn't process through the ringing in her ears. She'd been walking back from the McDonald's where she used their bathroom. 2 blocks from her usual spot. The alley had looked empty. It wasn't. 2 men. Maybe 3. She couldn't tell because her vision kept blurring. One grabbed her backpack. She held on by instinct, arms locked around the straps. A fist caught her in the ribs. Air left her lungs in a rush. She went down on her knees, still holding the bag. "Let go," someone said in Yoruba. That's when she understood. These weren't random thieves. Random thieves would have taken the bag and run. These men wanted something specific. They knew what was in it. "Where is it?" The voice switched to English. Accented. Lagos accent, but not Ejigunal. "Somewhere wealthier." "The drive. Give it to us and we leave." Zainab's hands tightened on the straps. A boot pressed into her shoulder, pushed her flat against the ground. Asphalt scraped her cheek. Last chance. She thought about her father. About the way his body had looked in the morgue after they pulled him from that ditch. About her mother dying 6 months later from grief that doctors couldn't cure. About the fact that if she let go of this bag, they'd both have died for nothing. Her hand found a broken bottle near the dumpster. She swung without thinking. Glass connected with something soft. A scream. The boot left her shoulder. Zainab rolled, stumbled to her feet, started running with the bag clutched to her chest. Behind her, footsteps. Shouting. Something metal clattering against pavement. She ran 3 blocks before her legs gave out behind a closed laundromat. Collapsed against the wall. Checked the bag with shaking hands. Still there. Flash drive still sewn into the lining. Blood dripped from her nose onto her jacket. Her ribs screamed every time she breathed. But she was alive. More importantly, the drive was still hers. She pressed her back against the wall and tried to think through the pain. They'd found her, which meant someone had been watching, tracking her movements, waiting for the right moment, which meant they knew she had evidence, which meant they were scared. Zainab wiped blood from her face with her sleeve. Her hands were still shaking, but something else was happening too. Something cold and sharp crystallizing in her chest where fear used to be. Clarity. She'd been waiting for the right moment to expose the truth. Researching. Planning. Being careful. But careful was a luxury she didn't have anymore. The wedding was in 12 days. After that, Darius would be untouchable. Protected by political connections that made investigations disappear. And Moreo would keep killing anyone who threatened to talk. Girls like her. Fathers like hers. Anyone who got in the way. She pulled out her phone. No service, but McDonald's Wi-Fi reached this far. She typed 2 words into the search bar. Darius Blackwell wedding venue. The results loaded slowly. Society pages. Wedding announcements. Photos of the estate where the ceremony would take place. Overlooking the Hudson. Private security. Guest list including senators and CEOs and people whose names made news. The kind of place where a homeless girl had no business being. The kind of place where everyone would be watching. Perfect. Zainab put the phone away. Touched her ribs gently and winced. She'd need ice. Maybe stitches. Definitely rest. But first, she needed to move. Because if they'd found her once, they'd find her again. She stood up slowly. Every muscle protested. Blood had dried on her collar. Her vision was still blurry at the edges. But she started walking. Away from her usual spots. Away from the beauty supply store. Away from the subway entrance where Darius handed her $5 every morning. Toward the public library that opened at 9. Toward the computer where she'd copied the files. Toward the decision she'd been avoiding for 2 years. She was done being invisible. She was done being the girl people walked past without seeing. She was done letting rich men sleep well at night because $5 bought them permission to look away. The wedding was in 12 days. And Zainab finally knew exactly what she was going to do. The next morning at 6:10, Darius stood at the subway entrance waiting. She never came. The $5 bill felt different in Darius's hand. Heavier somehow. Or maybe it was just his imagination. Maybe guilt had weight after all. He'd been standing at the subway entrance for 4 minutes, checking his watch, looking down the street, waiting for a girl who had never once been late in 362 days. 6:14. Still no sign of her. A businessman pushed past him on the way to catch a train. Someone's coffee cup rolled down the sidewalk in the morning wind. Darius shifted his weight. Told himself he'd wait 1 more minute. 6:15 came and went. His driver texted, "Ready when you are." Darius stared at the $5 bill. Andrew Jackson's face looked back at him. The same face he'd been looking at every morning for almost a year. $5. The exact amount he'd calculated would make him feel like a decent person without actually changing his life. Not 10. Not 20. Definitely not enough to actually help someone off the streets. Just enough to let him sleep at night. He folded the bill, put it back in his pocket, walked to where his driver waited 1 block over. "Everything okay, Mr. Blackwell?" "Fine." But it wasn't fine. His hands wouldn't stop shaking. His chest felt tight. And for the first time in his entire adult life, Darius Blackwell didn't know what he was running from. The day passed in meetings he barely remembered. Conference calls that blurred together. His assistant asked him 3 times if he was feeling well. "I'm fine," he kept saying. At 2 in the afternoon, Marcus called. "We found something." Darius closed his office door. "What?" The girl, Zainab Afolayan, 19 years old, Nigerian national, entered the country 2 years ago on temporary documentation that expired 18 months ago. And her father was Olumide Afolayan, logistics coordinator for a Nigerian oil subcontractor. Died 2 years ago in what local police ruled an accidental death. Darius sat down slowly. "What subcontractor?" "Company called Moreo Energy Solutions." The room tilted. Darius gripped the edge of his desk. Blood pounded in his ears so loudly he almost didn't hear Marcus continue. "There's more." Nigerian authorities flagged the death as suspicious but never followed up. The man who owned the company was behind Moreo. Silence on the other end. "How did you know that?" Darius didn't answer. His brain was racing backward through 6 years of contracts and signatures and reports he'd skimmed instead of read. Partnership with Moreo Energy Solutions. Projected returns. Infrastructure development. Clean paperwork. No red flags. Except there had been red flags. His legal team had mentioned them. Documentation issues. Local complications. Nothing unusual for emerging markets. Nothing unusual except for the bodies that piled up when people asked questions. Bodies like Olumide Afolayan. "Mr. Blackwell, you still there?" "Yeah." His voice sounded strange in his own ears. "Where is she now?" "Unknown. She hasn't been back to her usual locations in 2 days. 2 days. Since the morning after that man had been standing at the subway entrance watching him. Find her." "We're trying. But if she's gone underground." "Find her, Marcus." He hung up, sat alone in his office as afternoon light stretched across the floor. Then he did something he hadn't done in 6 years. He opened the original file from the Moreo partnership. The full file. Not the summary his lawyers had prepared. The actual documents. 300 pages of contracts and appendices and financial projections. He started reading. By page 40, his hands were shaking. By page 70, he understood why his father had looked so defeated that night in Detroit. By page 95, he knew exactly why Zainab Afolayan had been standing at that subway entrance every morning for almost a year. She hadn't been there because she needed $5. She'd been there because she was waiting. The wedding was in 10 days. That evening, Darius drove himself home. Dismissed his driver. Walked through his penthouse turning on lights he didn't need. He poured whiskey. Didn't drink it. Stood by the window watching the city glow. His phone buzzed. Elena. He didn't answer. It buzzed again. Her father. He didn't answer that either. At 11:30, he finally fell asleep in his clothes on top of the covers. He dreamed about his father sitting in that old study, taking off his glasses, explaining why sometimes the cost of doing the right thing is more than you can afford to pay. In the dream, 12-year-old Darius asked a different question. What if the cost of doing the wrong thing is more? His father didn't have an answer. The next morning, Darius's alarm went off at 5:45. He got dressed, left his building, walked his usual route. At 6:10 exactly, he reached the subway entrance. Empty. He stood there for 5 minutes. 10. 15. Then he heard footsteps behind him. Darius turned. The girl was there. But she looked different. Thinner. A bruise darkened her left cheekbone. Her jacket was torn at the shoulder. They stared at each other across 10 feet of morning sidewalk. Darius pulled the $5 bill from his pocket. Held it out. Waited. Zainab didn't move. The wind picked up. A truck rattled past. Someone's alarm went off in an apartment above them. Then Zainab spoke for the second time in 363 days. Darius Blackwell. His name in her mouth was a complete sentence. An accusation. A question. A verdict. He opened his mouth to respond. To explain. To apologize. To say something that would make the weight in his chest feel lighter. But no words came out. Because what do you say to someone whose father died so you could make 9 figures? What do you say to the girl you tried to pay off with $5? Zainab looked at the money in his hand. Then at his face. Then back at the money. She didn't take it. She turned and walked away. Darius stood frozen with his arm still extended, the $5 bill trembling in his hand, watching her disappear into the morning crowd. And for the first time in a year, he didn't go to work. He went home, called his assistant, cancelled everything. Then he sat in his empty penthouse and finally opened the email from Kihind Moreo that he'd been avoiding for 3 days. The music stopped first. 200 guests turned toward the entrance like synchronized swimmers. Phones rose. Breaths caught. The string quartet's instruments hung silent in their hands. Elena grabbed Darius's arm. Her nails bit through the fabric of his tuxedo. The officiant cleared his throat. Senator Whitcomb half stood from his seat in the front row, confusion crossing his face. But Darius just stared. Because walking down the center aisle between rows of white chairs and imported flowers was Zainab. The same torn jacket. The same bruised face. Walking barefoot on marble that cost more per square foot than most people's monthly rent. Security moved in from both sides. Marcus appeared from somewhere near the back, speaking rapidly into his wrist. Darius raised his hand. The same gesture he'd used every morning for almost a year. The universal signal for stop. Everyone froze. "Let her speak," Darius said. Elena's grip tightened. "What are you doing?" "Let her speak." The guests erupted in whispers. Cameras clicked. Someone's phone buzzed loudly enough that people turned to stare. Zainab stopped 10 feet from the altar. She reached into her plastic shopping bag and pulled out the flash drive. Held it up between 2 fingers where everyone could see. "My name is Zainab Afolayan," she said. Her voice was quiet, but it carried across the silent room like a stone dropped into still water. 2 years ago, my father was murdered in Lagos, Nigeria. A gasp rippled through the crowd. He worked for Moreo Energy Solutions, a company that launders oil money through offshore accounts and shell corporations, a company that bribes government officials and kills anyone who tries to report them. Senator Whitcomb was fully standing now. His face had gone red. Zainab kept talking. "Before he died, my father collected evidence. Bank statements, email chains, signed contracts, proof that connects Kihind Moreo to illegal operations across 3 continents." She turned slightly. Not to Darius. To the guests. Proof that also connects Moreo to American investment firms who profit from those operations. Firms that ask no questions as long as the returns are good. Firms like Blackwell Capital Management. The room exploded. Chairs scraped. Voices overlapped. Elena's mother stood up. Marcus spoke urgently into his wrist again. But Darius couldn't move. Because the pieces were finally connecting in his head. The report he'd skimmed. The deal he'd signed. The file his lawyers had summarized with words like complications and documentation issues. The $5 he'd given a girl every morning to make himself feel like those decisions didn't matter. "Everything is on this drive," Zainab said. She held it higher. Dates. Amounts. Names. Enough to put Kihind Moreo in prison for the rest of his life. She paused. "Let that sink in. He sent men to kill me 3 days ago. To destroy this evidence before I could show anyone. Before this wedding could lock his business partners into political families that would protect them forever." Senator Whitcomb started moving toward the aisle. 2 other men in dark suits followed him. Zainab's voice got louder. "Darius Blackwell gave me $5 every morning. $5. For almost a year." She finally looked directly at him. "I thought it was guilt. Now I know it was just maintenance. The exact cost he calculated his conscience was worth." Elena released Darius's arm. Stepped back. Her face had gone pale. "Is this true?" she whispered. Darius opened his mouth. But before he could answer, the back doors burst open. Federal agents in dark jackets flooded the room. FBI printed across their backs in yellow letters. They moved with the kind of precision that said they'd been planning this for a while. A woman in a gray suit walked straight down the aisle to where Zainab stood. Held out her hand for the drive. Miss Afolayan, I'm Special Agent Patricia Reynolds. We've been looking for you. Zainab hesitated, looked at the drive in her hand, then at Darius. He knew, she said quietly. Maybe not everything, but enough. And he signed anyway. Agent Reynolds nodded, took the drive carefully like it was made of glass. Then she turned to the crowd. Behind Moreo was arrested 2 hours ago at his hotel in Manhattan. We've been building a case against him for 18 months. Miss Afolayan's evidence will help us close it. The room erupted again, this time louder. Phones recording. Guests pushing toward the exits. Elena's mother screaming at someone about how this was supposed to be a private ceremony. But Darius just stood there watching Zainab. She looked smaller than she had at the subway entrance. Younger. Exhausted in a way that went deeper than bruises. Agent Reynolds was saying something about protective custody. About testimony. About justice finally being served. Zainab wasn't listening. She was still staring at Darius. And in that moment, he finally understood what his father had meant all those years ago. The cost of doing the wrong thing wasn't money. Wasn't reputation. Wasn't even guilt. It was standing in a room full of people while a 19-year-old girl looks at you like you're the reason her entire world burned down. And knowing she's right. The headlines hit before the wedding guests even made it home. Billionaire's wedding disrupted by corruption allegations. Federal agents arrest Nigerian oil executive at Manhattan ceremony. Homeless teen exposes multimillion-dollar laundering scheme. Darius's phone rang 417 times in the first 6 hours. He answered none of them. He resigned from Blackwell Capital Management on a Tuesday morning via a 4-sentence email to his board of directors. Effective immediately. No press conference. No explanation beyond what the federal investigation would eventually reveal. His assets were frozen within 48 hours. Not all of them. Just enough to hurt. The government moved carefully when wealthy people had expensive lawyers. But Darius didn't fight it. Elena's father called once. Said things Darius deleted from his voicemail without listening to the whole message. Elena herself didn't call at all. She released a statement through her publicist about being shocked and betrayed. Darius moved out of his penthouse into a hotel room he paid for with a credit card that still worked. He spent 3 weeks reading every page of the Moreo deal, every email his team had flagged, every report he'd told himself was too complicated to understand. It wasn't complicated. It was just easier to not look closely. Behind Moreo was extradited to Nigeria after 2 months of legal proceedings. The case against him was airtight. Zainab's evidence combined with 18 months of federal investigation created a paper trail even expensive lawyers couldn't blur. He was sentenced to 23 years. 4 other men went down with him. American executives. British investors. People whose names Darius recognized from business conferences and charity galas. People like him. The investigation into Blackwell Capital took longer. Forensic accountants combed through 6 years of transactions. They found exactly what they were looking for. Darius wasn't criminally charged. His lawyers made sure of that. But civil suits started piling up. Shareholders. Investors. People who'd trusted their money to a firm that had looked the other way while partnering with killers. He settled most of them quietly. 4 months after the wedding that never happened, Darius finally got the call he'd been waiting for. Zainab had agreed to meet him. They met at a coffee shop in Brooklyn. Neutral territory. Agent Reynolds sat at a nearby table reading a newspaper, but obviously listening. Zainab looked different. Clean clothes. Hair pulled back neatly. The bruise on her face had faded to yellow. She was drinking hot chocolate. Real hot chocolate, not the instant kind. Darius sat down across from her with nothing in his hands. They didn't speak for almost a minute. Then Darius slid an envelope across the table. Zainab looked at it but didn't touch it. "It's not money," Darius said quietly. "Then what is it?" "A confession. Signed. Notarized. Everything I knew and when I knew it. Everything I chose to ignore." He paused. "And a commitment. Full funding for a foundation dedicated to victims of corporate exploitation in Nigeria. Your father's name on it. Run however you want." Zainab stared at the envelope. "You think that fixes it?" "No. You think that makes you a good person?" "No." She finally looked at him. "Then why?" Darius thought about his father in that study in Detroit. About the choice between looking away and looking close. About all the mornings he'd walked past her with $5 and told himself it was enough. Because I thought $5 made me different from the men I did business with. His voice cracked. It didn't. It just made me visible. Zainab's hand moved toward the envelope. Stopped. Pulled back. My father used to say there are two kinds of people in the world. People who see wrong and do nothing. And people who see wrong and become part of it. She picked up her hot chocolate. You were both. The words hit harder than any lawsuit. Darius nodded. I was. So what are you now? He didn't have an answer for that. Agent Reynolds stood up. Time was running out. Zainab took the envelope. Tucked it into her bag. The same bag she'd carried for 2 years with her father's evidence sewn into the lining. I'm not forgiving you, she said. I know. I'm taking this because other people deserve justice. Not because you deserve peace. I know. She stood up. Put on a jacket that wasn't torn anymore. Looked at him one more time. My father died trying to do the right thing. You got rich doing the wrong thing and sleeping fine anyway. She turned to leave. Then stopped. The difference is he died human. You just stopped being one. She walked out of the coffee shop into afternoon sunlight. Darius sat alone at the table for 20 minutes after she left. Then he paid for her hot chocolate and went back to his hotel room. He spent the next year working with lawyers to dismantle what he'd built, transferring assets, setting up the foundation, testifying in civil cases against former partners who'd done exactly what he'd done but refused to admit it. Some nights he couldn't sleep. Some nights he stood by hotel windows looking at the city and thinking about a girl who'd stood in the cold every morning waiting for justice while he handed her $5 and walked away. He never went back to the subway entrance at 125th Street. Never walked past it. Never drove by it. Never let himself pretend that spot was anything except what it was. The place where he'd tried to buy his way out of consequence. The place where a 19-year-old girl had been braver than him every single day. The place where $5 had revealed exactly who he was. 2 years later, the Afolayan Foundation opened its first office in Lagos, providing legal support, documentation assistance, and protection for whistleblowers trying to expose corporate corruption. Zainab ran it from New York. She never went back to Nigeria. Too many ghosts. Too many men who still had friends. But she made sure her father's name was on everything. Made sure every person they helped knew the story. Knew what speaking truth had cost him. Knew he'd died human. Darius sent money every month. Anonymous donations that kept the lights on and the lawyers paid. He never asked for recognition. Never asked to meet with her again. Just sent the money and tried to figure out how to live with the kind of guilt that $5 couldn't fix. Because some debts can't be paid. Some sins don't come with receipts. And some mornings, the weight of who you are is heavier than any amount of money you'll ever move. The last time anyone saw them in the same room was at a congressional hearing 3 years later. Zainab was testifying about corporate accountability. Darius was in the back row, listening. When it ended, reporters swarmed her with questions. One asked what she'd say to Darius Blackwell if she could. Zainab looked past the cameras, past the reporters, straight to where he stood against the back wall. I'd ask him one question. What question? She kept her eyes on Darius. Was it worth it? Then she walked away. And Darius stood there with the answer stuck in his throat. Because no, it never was. If this story moved you, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss the next story that'll make you think differently about the world. Drop a comment below about a time someone's small action revealed their true character. Your story might inspire someone else. And remember, the most powerful thing you can do is refuse to look away when it matters most. See you in the next one.